Leading scientists urge us to cut global climate emissions in half this decade to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, and we need to be carbon neutral by mid-century. We need to be decarbonizing our electricity sector, our buildings and transportation, and also changing our food and farming systems. Transportation is now the largest source of climate emissions in our state, now that we've made some progress moving off of coal. This podcast will explore how we remove roadblocks to a carbon neutral Michigan, and in a way that centers justice and creates good jobs.
Our guest, Dr. Jonathan Foley, is a world-renowned environmental scientist and sustainability expert. His work is focused on understanding our changing planet and finding new solutions to sustain the climate, ecosystems, and natural resources we all depend on. He's the executive director of Project Drawdown, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to uncover the most substantive solutions to stop climate change and to communicate them to the world.
Well, let's put it this way. People who are benefit from the status quo have been very good at convincing people of a lot of lies. For decades, they try to convince people or just instill a little bit of doubt that, well, climate change isn't even happening. It's just a hoax. Well, they played that game for 30 to 40 years, and then we're on to them now. The other one is that, addressing climate change is too expensive, or it will hurt the economy and that kind of thing. Like, no, the opposite is true. In fact, we can't afford not to address climate change.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Speaking of Resilience podcast. I'm your co-host, Dan Worth, with the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities.
And I'm your co-host, Kate Madigan, with the Michigan Climate Action Network.
And here at Groundwork, we often work cross-sector, food, energy, mobility programs, and we're always looking for those sweet spots where those areas overlap. So it's particularly interesting to hear from Dr. Foley on this podcast. And there was a beautiful conference down in Grand Rapids last year, Rise Up and Drawdown conference held in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Kate, I think you were there, where folks from around the state came together to sort of build this momentum for a climate neutral state.
I was, and it was an excellent conference. In fact, Project Drawdown founder Paul Hawken was there speaking about the Project Drawdown book that was released in 2017 and the comprehensive solutions that the book laid out and all of the research that went into it. The book tells us exactly how much each solution can reduce climate emissions. And it looks at solutions we often think about, but also some that we often don't really think about as having a huge impact on climate emissions. So it includes onshore wind turbines and improving public transit, and then also things like moving to more plant-based diets and reducing food waste. In this interview, Dr. Foley talks about how you can access these resources. So without further ado, here's our interview with Dr. Jonathan Foley. Dr. Foley, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today, and I really appreciate and want to thank you for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
The first question to get us started, I'd love it if you could tell us about your background and what brought you to Project Drawdown.
Oh, well, I'm a scientist by training. I'm actually a climate scientist. My doctorate's in atmospheric science and oceanography from the University of Wisconsin, actually, right next to Michigan. And then I was a professor actually at Madison for a number of years, and then moved to Minnesota after that and was a director of a large environmental research institute at the University of Minnesota. But then after that, I've been a scientist most of my life, but I care a lot about how we communicate science to the broader world. And I had an opportunity to come to San Francisco and be the head of a really large science museum here in the Bay Area called the California Academy of Sciences. And did that for about 4 years, and then left about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago now. And then joined as the new director of Project Drawdown, a small nonprofit devoted to climate solutions and communicating them to the world about a year and a half ago.
Fantastic. And the science background is super interesting. Looking through the report and the work you guys do, there's such amazing scientists from all the various areas giving their data. Oftentimes that cannot get communicated well, but when you guys write this, it's really reads as if it's for the public in a wonderful way. So your background probably helps explain some of that, but I wonder if you could dive in a little deeper on how you communicate this data and science to a public that wants to hear sound bites and more simple things.
Yeah, there's really a lot of unfortunate institutional issues or whatever that really limit the ability of communicating science to the broader world. Part of it, I think, is that scientists are trained quite in very specialized ways, where you tend to use kind of jargon, very specialized language, which is hyper precise and all this kind of thing. And it really speaks to your immediate colleagues, and that's fine for some communication, but it doesn't, work in, when you go down to the local cafe, right?
Right.
So I think we scientists have to learn, kind of unlearn perhaps what we've learned in graduate school, and learn how to, actually write again, like in real English, or in, more like in, using actual active verbs, and not the third voice, passive voice and third pronoun. The other issue, I think, is sometimes the media tends to, like things that are a little over sensationalized. I mean, that's not all media, clearly, but, things like cable news and what we see in social media tends to amplify the most vitriolic, the most sensationalized version of any story, political, scientific, economic, whatever it is. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. You have a lot of really talented people who know the science, but they don't know how to communicate so well. And you have a lot of people who communicate who are trying to get clicks and votes, and that kind of thing. So it's not a really good landscape for science communication. But on the good side of it, there are a lot of really passionate science communicators who are trained both in some of the science and as well the communication arts, if you will, that are needed to share this stuff with the world accurately, but also in a way that's engaging. And that's one of the reasons I really like Project Drawdown. I was not there for the original version of Drawdown, which was aiming towards writing the book that came out a couple years ago. A few of your listeners and viewers will probably recognize this. That was written before my time, and it was actually really a genius project because the team really was about half scientists, half writers. So it was a really good way of engaging, both the data, but also the audience. And at Drawdown, we're not a university. Nobody's trying to gun for tenure, that kind of thing. We're not a advocacy organization. Our sole purpose is to just be synthesizing information about climate solutions and sharing it in an engaging way with the world. That's our mission. So that kind of thing is rewarded, and we designed a team accordingly. So
fantastic.
Yeah. So when it first came out, the first Drawdown, I got it right away, and I think I pre-ordered it. And I was so amazed how it quantified all of these different solutions for how we can draw down our emissions globally. And then I have been looking at the updated one that you just released this year, and I was particularly impressed by how simple and comprehensive, especially the framework is that you put together, the reduce sources, support sinks, and improve society. Can you talk a little bit for our listeners about that framework that you put together on how we draw down our emissions?
Yeah. Well, thanks for reading all that too. I appreciate that. It's good to know people are actually looking at this stuff. Yeah, the framework we used in the second Drawdown volume is really very important, actually. I'm glad you picked up on it, because there's a lot of confusion out there about how will we get to climate change solutions? How do we stop climate change? If you think of the atmosphere, this sounds weird at first, but it's really helpful. If you think of the atmosphere as like, imagine a giant container of stuff, air in the sky. That's what the atmosphere, a bunch of gas. But if you think of it like a bathtub, which sounds really weird at first, this is actually pretty helpful. When you add stuff to the bathtub, you turn on the faucet, right? You get to control the faucet. You turn it up, you turn it down. That's what we call sources. Those are the emissions of gases into that container. So for greenhouse gases, that's the burning of fossil fuels, the burning of forest, the other emissions of those gases that go into the atmosphere, whether they're carbon dioxide or methane or nitrous oxide, all of those human-made gases that add to the natural greenhouse effect. But the atmosphere is also removing some of those things. And that's kind of where the other part of the bathtub comes in. That's what we call the sinks. In your bathtub, it's the drain, what empties that container and removes things out of the atmosphere or out of that bathtub in the sky, if you will. It turns out we humans don't do that at all right now. It's all about nature. It turns out the forest and oceans remove about 40% roughly of the greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere every year, leaving about 60% of them behind. And that means every year there's a little bit more being put in the bathtub, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And so that's a weird kind of mental model. But what my point is, when your bathtub's overflowing, you have to turn off the faucet and you need the drain to work, right? You need both of those things to work well to draw the water down again back to where it's supposed to be. Same thing with the atmosphere. If we're going to stop climate change, we first and foremost have to turn off the emissions. That is every coal power plant, every internal combustion engine, every furnace, every forest that's on fire, all these things have to go to zero in the next few decades for us to have any chance of stopping climate change. And this is not or, it's and. We need nature to be preserved and kind of protected so it can still naturally absorb some of those greenhouse gases, removing some of them out of the atmosphere. And if we're very, very clever, maybe we humans could add to that by planting more trees and maybe farming differently. There's a lot of excitement about that. Or building machines that could remove some of that carbon out of the atmosphere. But again, maybe abusing this bathtub analogy too much. If your bathtub's overflowing, you turn off the faucet first, then you pick up the mop. If your only answer to climate change is, I'll remove the pollution in the atmosphere after I put it there.
Yeah.
It's like, that's crazy. It's a lot simpler to just not put it there in the first place. So that's why we need to kind of deal with the sources of pollution and what we call these sinks of pollution. So those are the first two pillars of drawdown: reduce the sources to zero, help enhance and preserve the sinks of greenhouse gases, which right now are primarily natural. And then third, we talk about improving society. That's obviously we should do that anyway, whether this planet is warming or not. There are a lot of things we need to improve about our society, but some of them turn out to have effects on climate change as well that can be very positive. In particular, we've written a lot about how the improving access to education and healthcare, especially to women and girls around the world, can actually have not only huge societal benefits that are multidimensional, but also in the long term helps us address climate change too, partly by lowering the kind of future growth of population in a voluntary way, where women have more control over their reproductive health, more economic opportunities, more education. Statistically speaking, when that happens, women tend to have fewer children who are healthier and are much more likely to survive, and maybe have them later in life. And so that tends to slow the growth of families a little bit, and while simultaneously opening up opportunities. But there are many other places where improving society can also have climate benefits, like helping indigenous communities maintain their rights over land, for example, helps protect forest, which helps protect the atmosphere too. So that's why we look at these kind of three legs of the stool, like let's stop pollution, let's preserve nature and its sinks, and let's help society itself so that society in turn can do a better job of addressing climate change. And we need all three. It's an all of the above kind of approach.
Fantastic. No, and sticking with the bathtub analogy, I think a lot of the frame of the report is on sort of global solutions and big scale how we do it. Here in Michigan, we're trying to sort of drill down into what our state can do. And there was a great drawdown conference last year down in Grand Rapids that got everybody really fired up and excited. And so it was a good first event to sort of push the work forward. I'm wondering if you have advice or suggestions on the best ways for states and cities and universities to take this and make it their own, take it from global to state and even more local than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited you asked that, because I think there's a lot we need to do at the local and state level. In fact, that's where a lot of the really cool action's happening, is at these levels, because at the federal policy level from Washington anyway, there isn't as much going on as we would really like, obviously. But there's a tremendous amount going on in various states and communities, cities, businesses, NGOs, other things that are actually quite positive. So yeah, we really should talk about that. Drawdown is, as you mentioned, though, dealing with kind of a global overview of solutions that we're not drilling down to, well, here are the solutions that would be best for Michigan versus, Maine, for example. So we need to kind of dive in a little bit. As a first cut, I guess if I were giving advice to any particular community or state, I would ask, like, well, what are your biggest sources of emissions? Globally, the biggest source, but only by a hair, is electricity production. Burning coal and natural gas produces about 25% of climate change's effects on the atmosphere. But the food system is the next 24%, just a very close number too. And but that's global. That wouldn't be true in Michigan, because that global number includes a lot of the deforestation that's happening in the tropics, which is a huge part of that, or a lot of the methane coming out of beef cattle and dairy operations, which, you know, you have some in Michigan, some dairy, but not a lot of beef action going on. So I think Michigan's emissions would be quite different. And so you need to kind of scale the solutions accordingly. So if you here, I live in the Bay Area in California. California's emissions are overwhelmingly driven by transportation now. We have some of the cleanest electrical grids in the country for large grids anyway. And the food part is still there, but like 45% of the emissions around this state are from basically road transportation. So that's the biggest problem where we are. But where you are, I suspect it's more in the electricity sector still.
Transportation actually just overtook electricity recently in Michigan because we've been moving off of coal for our electricity.
And that's a national trend too. Yeah, I know that I used to live in, you know, Wisconsin and Minnesota. That the upper Midwest and has a bit of a heavier dose of coal than some other parts of the country, depending which grid you're on. And it's nice to see, as you know, the coal being phased out nationally is having a big effect, but in particular states, it's really having a big effect, and that's really good to hear. But transportation is still a doozy.
No, it is, and here we are in this state that sort of moved the dial on mobility innovation, you know, for the last century, or at least a large chunk of it. And so we're seeing exciting solutions come out of the automakers and folks starting to step up. And it's interesting, the COVID experience is taking a lot of people off the roads too. So we're seeing it happen in the face of an immediate crisis.
Yeah, but that's not a way to solve climate change, that's for sure.
Right. Agreed.
But yeah, it's good to see that some automakers are, you know, certainly trying to innovate in this space. I would encourage them to do more. We've known how to do a lot of these things since the 70s, right? And it's not that, you know, electrification of the grid, of the transportation networks, you know, electric cars, electric trains, obviously is the medium-term goal. But there's a lot we can do with just, you know, I'm really upset that some car companies are fighting things like the new California emission standards for vehicles and that kind of thing, which, you know, to me, it seems crazy that we still make cars that get under 50 miles per gallon, even if they're still fossil fuel cars. Like, why do we do this? Except for the very few cases where people truly, you know, if you're a contractor, you're a, you know, a flower delivery business or something, you need a van, you need a pickup truck, sure. But for most of us, in a small, efficient vehicle that we don't use very often is perfectly fine. And yet we still don't even do that. I think we have a lot of low-hanging fruit still to pick on energy efficiency, even as we move to electric vehicles, which will clearly be in the long-term play.
Yes, and public transportation as well. And your reports quantify just how big of a difference each of these different solutions that are already available to us. The technology of all of your solutions is already available to us, correct? And yeah.
Well, that's an interesting thing about Drawdown is we don't speculate about solutions. We only look at solutions that truly exist in the real world, where third-party scientists and engineers and analysts have actually analyzed the performance of a solution from a distance. We don't, often we get very angry letters from like venture capitalists, startups, and say, yes, but my solution will save the world. And trust me, here are my data about some solution on a lab bench or something, which, you know, might be fantastic. We're really looking forward to these coming out in the world. But until they actually exist in the real marketplace and enough data to really say, yep, this is a real solution, folks, we don't even put it in. And so the interesting thing is, like, that means we're fairly conservative about our solution set because we're not even counting future solutions. We're only counting the ones that are here today in 2020. And as you pointed out, Kate, a lot of these are ones we've had since, you know, way back when, and they're like, gee, public transportation. You know, America used to have better public transportation in the 1930s and 20s than we do today. Streetcars, better train systems. So this isn't new technology. Or just, you know, walking more, or better designed cities, stopping sprawl, a little more fuel efficiency, or video conferencing. You know, that is a relatively new technology, but not that new. And so there are a lot of things we can do right here, right now. And sure, as new technologies come in, great, we'll put them in the mix. But and the good news is right now, we already have enough in our hands to do almost all of what we need to do. And that's really good news.
And I want to make that connection back to the improving society part of the framework, because public transportation, for example, so much about improving society is about equity too. And if we go back to having a better public transportation sector in the US and Michigan and globally, it's just going to benefit everyone. It's going to mean a more equitable society too, because that's a key piece to our transportation, changing our transportation sector, and especially in allowing everyone to have access to reliable, good transportation.
Yeah, and I think it cuts both ways. I would agree with you. I think having better public transit that works for everybody helps everybody. So it's kind of axiomatic. I think it's really, really true. But I think the reverse is true too. If we have more equity and less polarization in our communities, we might have better cities where people, for so long, a lot of people were fleeing the kind of large metropolitan areas, especially, like upper middle class, educated, more predominantly white communities would be fleeing the cities and causing more sprawl, which, just choked up our highways and things like this. But now you see people moving back to cities in many places, but then that's driving up rent, causing, kind of gentrification and displacement. And then poorer people have to move far away from the city to just be able to afford to live there. I mean, I live in, again, in San Francisco, which has got to have the worst rents in the country. And, if you're like a middle class, you're a nurse or a firefighter, people who are so critical to our society, it'd be almost impossible to live in metropolitan San Francisco today. Or if you're a school teacher, and that's a shame, and it distorts our society. So I think on one hand, more equity. Well, let me put it this way: if we fix our transportation systems, we can improve equity. But I think if we improve equity, we can improve our transportation challenges at the same time. It works in both directions.
Yeah,
if you see what I mean.
Yep. You mentioned briefly the indigenous lands and communities and sort of the large impact that can have, both from a forestation perspective and just a land management perspective. Can you dig a little deeper into that for us? Some of the solutions or overall themes of that work?
Yeah, there's actually been a lot of analysis of this in the scientific literature that we noticed again and again and again, that when scientists look at landscapes, especially forest, that have been managed by indigenous communities versus those managed by other folks, that the ones that are held by indigenous communities time and time again tend to be healthier forest with more biodiversity, more productivity, and they store more carbon. And this that's kind of amazing. And time and time and time again, this is just true. It just shows up all over the place. And you might think, oh, this is only true in like the far reaches of the Amazon or somewhere in very, very remote parts of the world. But that's not necessarily true. For your listeners in Michigan, for example, just look a little west of you in the state of Wisconsin. If you look at Wisconsin from orbit, from space, you see a big dark green rectangle in the upper kind of left-hand corner. It's darker green than all the other forest and has a noticeable rectangular kind of shape to it. And you're like, what the hell is that? Well, it turns out it's the Menominee Nation. It's a Native American reservation, an indigenous community that has been, practicing sustainable forestry practices in the Menominee Nation for a long time. And the differences are now so visible, you can see them from outer space. That's kind of crazy. So, this is not just somewhere, distant, far away stuff. It's like right in your backyard. We can see these things happening again and again.
No, it's
and
great.
It's not perfect, but again, the idea that empowering more people is something we should do anyway. That's more important than climate change, is in my point of view. And I'm a climate guy, and this is what I think about all day long. But obviously, a more just and equitable society can have other kind of secondary benefits. And to climate change, but especially around education and healthcare, where women have not had equal access to men, but also indigenous communities and how they manage their own lands are kind of two levers we've already identified that have kind of that, kind of a double win effect of both improving society, but also helping us combat climate change at the same time. And that's really good news.
Yeah, that's great. And I am a Boston kid who moved up to Traverse 5 or 6 years ago, and am in Leelanau County now. And I'll say the way the local community here treats the land and orchards and all our ag production is just amazing. Coming from the East Coast, I've In a city, I've never seen it before. So just even seeing that local knowledge and wisdom playing out in how the land and food and people are managed is just can make such an impact.
Well, you raised a really good point too, and it gets back to this idea of like local solutions. I think one of the failures in climate change activity, whether it's policy, activism, science, all of it, has been maybe a little bit too much kind of top-down thinking. We've been talking to like scientists, to UN officials, to politicians in national capitals. They tend to kind of think in a global kind of abstract way. And the atmosphere thinks that way. And the atmosphere doesn't care where you're coming from. It just cares what the atmosphere is global. It doesn't know boundaries. It just goes everywhere. We all share one atmosphere. So we do need that global perspective. But I think sometimes you're right. There's a lot of wisdom in the local communities all over the world of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different histories, different communities, both in cities and rural landscapes all over the world, just tapping the wisdom of everybody, not just a few. And unfortunately, too many people who work in climate change, whether in policy or science or education, look too much like me, like a middle-aged white guy with way too much privilege. And that doesn't mean we have to, people like me have to just step away completely, but we need to build a much bigger stage and make sure we really listen to lots of voices on this stuff. But I would also keep in mind, let's not forget the voice of nature and the atmosphere itself, the voice of the planet, and we have to be true to the data, not to just how we feel about it. But on the human side, we definitely need to do a better job of hearing many voices, and especially from different local communities who bring a lot to the table that maybe we've forgotten or not heard from as much. And that's really crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I looking at the list of how you quantify in Project Drawdown these solutions, and some of them, like the Indigenous land management, was surprising how much of an impact on drawing down the greenhouse gas emissions could be. Some things are not as surprising to probably a lot of people, like wind turbines and solar panels, but then other ones are really surprising, like reducing food waste and plant-rich diets are right up there in the top ones. Can you talk, are there some that surprised you when you looked at the results from this research?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. I remember quite vividly first hearing about Project Drawdown before I worked there. So this is in the first version, a book that came out a couple of years ago, that they had done the first round of research, which held up really quite well, even when we revised it, broadly speaking. And it pointed out that that a lot of the things we think about in climate change are a very small set of what really causes climate change. When we think about climate change, you ask most people, they'll think, smokestacks and tailpipes. They're going to think of, industrial pollution, power plants, our cars, airplanes, things like that. You don't tend to think about food and farms and forest. Mm-hmm. They turn out to be crucial. Mm-hmm. Again, about globally speaking, this wouldn't be true in Michigan, but globally, about a quarter of climate change is caused by the food system. The food system is clearing more land in our rainforests, causing deforestation. We have far too much animal agriculture, especially beef and dairy, than this planet can sustain. So we're putting more methane into the atmosphere every year, and methane levels are going up. We're also using too much fertilizer, causing emissions of what's called nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas that's adding to climate change. So food's a surprisingly large lever in the climate system, and we tend to forget about it. But in Drawdown, we didn't. And it pointed out that some of the biggest solutions to climate change would be to fix that quarter of the climate change puzzle, which is fixing the food system. And primarily, it's like, let's reduce food waste, change our diets, and let's grow food in better ways that preserve nature while growing our food. That's kind of the three level, of solutions for food. Food waste turned out to be the biggest one, though, strangely, because about 30 to 40% of all the food in the world is never even eaten. That's not just the US, it's the entire world. That's incredible. And it means that 30 to 40% of all the land used to grow it, all the pollution that it caused, all the water it used, everything wasn't even needed. That's incredible. Show me a system where you're throwing 30 to 40% of your product away, and I can show you a really big opportunity to make some savings. So this is a very low-hanging fruit, but the problem is food waste is so spread out. It's not all happening in one country, in one part of the supply chain. In rich countries, a lot of it happens near the consumer, near in restaurants, supermarkets, our homes, our schools, cafeterias, and so on. That we can maybe do something about, but it's spread out over every home, every restaurant, every institutional setting. In poor countries, though, a lot of the food waste is near the farmer because they grew the crop, but maybe it failed to get to the train on time, or the truck didn't arrive and broke down, or the food rotted in a warehouse and got eaten by insects or something. So that's kind of a double tragedy, that maybe the food isn't provided and the farmer didn't get paid. So this is a real problem in the world. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet to food waste, but it's something we can tackle in a lot of different places. And this is where a lot of community-based work can really help too. It's not only reduce food waste in your town and your community, but also share how you did it with other communities so they can pick up on it and share that and spread that idea around. And maybe we can make a real dent into this.
Yeah. And I think, what you're talking about brings up what's happening during the COVID-19 crisis, where farmers, because our food system was really hit hard, and a lot of farmers I read about having to dump crops because they couldn't get them to market. And then at the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities, where Dan works and where the MyCan is housed, we have a really strong food and farming program. And so that's a big part of our work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a related issue, is that the food system has become so kind of centralized to a few big producers, a few big supply chains, and the market has taught, market forces, if you will, drive us towards what looks like efficiency. Like, don't store anything, don't have duplicate supply chains, be lean and mean, just on time delivery, things, travel through very quickly. And instead of a whole bunch of redundancies and delays in the system, everything's super, quote unquote, efficient. That's great when everything's normal. But if a very efficient system has one linkage broken in it like that, it can upset everything. So maybe this is where, like, the local food production and having maybe a little redundancy in the system and a little extra, like, storage, which if you're only looking at profits, are terrible because you got to pay for those duplicate things and that storage. You don't want to do that. But from a food security point of view, it's a really good idea. You want some redundancy because that's your shock absorber. That's when things go bad. You got a backup. You don't jump out of an airplane with only one chute. You have a backup chute as well, right? And so this is the problem we have, is as the world gets kind of more shocks to the system, like a pandemic or an economic crisis, we need a little more shock absorbers. And a lot of times market forces drive you the other way to get rid of those things. But in some ways, we're better off with a little bit of redundancy, a little bit of, like, overlapping solutions, just in case. And we've probably learned a little bit of a painful lesson this time around.
Yeah, no, I think so too. And we up here in Traverse City, when COVID hit, turned to a local food relief fund effort where folks donated money to pay local farmers who lost their clients to distribute food to local food pantries and folks in need. So it was like this local optimization that was resilient and could jump in when the bigger system broke down. So maybe the redundancy is some local optimization and a little bit of local resilience in there in a lot of places.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think we're going to learn a lot from this moment in history, though I suspect we're going to be relearning a lot of things we knew before. That our grandparents knew this too. Anybody who lived through the Depression or a World War or something like that have seen big disruptions, and we haven't for a long time. Nothing like this anyway. And so this is some very painful lessons for society, but we need to learn them. So it won't be quite as painful the second time around, because these pandemics aren't. This isn't going to be the last one. Right. There are going to be more things like this.
Yeah. And it's still pretty early to be knowing what the lessons are, but are you seeing lessons from this pandemic crisis, how it might impact, how we're addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say a couple things. One is that obviously the immediate concern of a lot of us in the world should be addressing the immediate pandemic. Absolutely. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, it's like the analogy might be like a hurricane or a really big storm or these terrible fires we had in Australia and here in California. We always need to deal with immediate crises, and sometimes they overwhelm us like we have today. But we can't forget the large, long-term, big picture story of what's happening more slowly that's making these things happen anyway. Like climate change is happening kind of slowly but steadily, but causing these more epic storms and bigger and more severe fire seasons and stronger hurricane damages, things like this. Similarly, our destruction of forest and ecosystems and habitats, or exploiting wildlife and eating them and putting them in bushmeat markets and wet markets around the world, and breaking down natural ecosystems. Also, too much industrial livestock production with bad regulation, with too many animals too close to each other, near too many people, and all the animals are fed antibiotics all day long. This is a recipe for pandemics, or at least outbreaks of disease to come out too, and scientists have been pointing this out for decades. What I find kind of interesting is climate change kind of breaking down Earth's physical systems, our atmosphere, our oceans, our weather patterns, is happening on one hand, and then we're breaking down Earth's biological systems, our natural habitats, where animals are supposed to be and where people are not. We're breaking that down too. And what's unleashed out of both of them are the equivalent of storms. And the physical part, it's like a hurricane or a fire season, but in biology, that storm is a pandemic. It's a virus that should not be in the human population, that we've never experienced before, we've no immunity to, but we unleashed it onto ourselves and spread it around. So I think we need to always address the immediate danger, but never, ever forget the big picture of like, why are these things happening more frequently in the first place? And COVID-19 is not the first disease that come out of human-caused pandemics. There are like 50 at least novel viruses that have jumped from nature or livestock to people. About 80% of these new diseases we're seeing, including like, HIV, SARS, MERS, coronavirus, hantavirus, are novel. We never saw them before. And that's because, the human, footprint is kind of infringing into nature, and we're getting these kind of blowbacks of viral emergence. So this is a very dangerous phenomenon. So I hope that we learn the bigger picture. Like once we put out this fire, we need to look at why we get more of them. And I worry that our leadership isn't really looking at the big picture. In fact, the Trump administration canceled major programs where we're doing disease surveillance and doing things like preventative resilience building, preventative measures. Those were all eliminated in the administration a couple of years ago, and even more recently. And that's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. So I think we have to look at the big picture as well as the immediate concern. The other thing is, I get really annoyed if anybody thinks there's a silver lining to a pandemic. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people around the world losing their lives and huge societal disruptions. Unbelievably horrible. There's nothing to celebrate here. So yes, emissions have gone down. Yes, wildlife may be coming back temporarily. But in the big picture, this won't really matter that much if we go back to business as usual and it's nothing to celebrate. What we should do, I hope, is reflect and learn about, this phrase, build back better. Well, let's build back healthier too. Let's build back more justice. Let's build more equity. Let's build back more resilience. And, that better needs to be defined a little bit more. What better world do you mean specifically? It has to be very explicit here. But for me, it would be one like, hey, let's build back a world where our kind of prosperity doesn't depend on screwing over the planet and future generations and endangering ourselves in the process in ways we don't really understand. That's foolish, and we need to learn a lot of lessons here.
I'm so glad that's such a great answer. I'm so glad you addressed that, silver lining, that there is no silver lining. And when I think about the human suffering in Michigan, we're really hit hard by COVID-19, and we just had a 500-year storm that hit the Midland area, and it's just people are already suffering so much, and then this is layered on top of it. My
heart goes out to I think the nation was just blown away by what happened recently in Michigan, and we're going to see more and more of these things. Partly because these more extreme weather events will happen more frequently. They already are, but also aging infrastructure. The dams that were there were not up to what they needed to be for especially a new weather regime that we're in today. So with aging infrastructure, a government that's not really running at full speed, let's say, nationally and being able to handle these things. We haven't invested in the right things, and now we're getting more and more severe weather events. We're getting novel viral threats. Things that wouldn't have happened to the world in the mid-20th century are now happening, and we're also more poorly prepared for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, unfortunately, I think what happened in Michigan recently is just going to be seen more and more often, unfortunately, as we get more and more kind of these extreme events happening, whether they're biological or weather related, to a society that's probably less and less prepared for them. Where we tend to be more polarized. Our government, nationally and internationally, are fairly dysfunctional right now, regardless of which party you sit at. I don't think anybody's happy with what's happening in DC. And we've not spent enough on infrastructure, things like education. Our healthcare system is really fraying at the edges. So we have a lot of big institutional problems, and now we're throwing more and more things at it. It's not a good recipe.
So as folks start to emerge from COVID-19 and try to build back better, like we have a lot of listeners that don't work for NGOs and aren't so deep into the climate science and ideas. When your neighbor comes up to you and says, hey, what should I be doing? I know there are no silver bullets. That's one of the main takeaways. But any advice for what folks can do on their own to sort of start making a difference? And when your neighbor asks you or family members, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, well, first, we do have to address people's immediate needs. Of course, their healthcare, their housing, their well-being, their jobs. So, that's obviously going to take a lot of precedence. So, but, let's assume we can, let's work on taking care of that. Yeah. But as we think about our communities and our families and our nation and beyond, we need to think about resilience, how resilient are we to these systems? What can we do personally? But also, I think after like a major disruption like the last recession or 9/11, I think we kind of stood back and reevaluated our role in the world a little bit. At least I felt that way personally. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people did. It was a little bit of a wake-up call about what's important to you, what's important to your family, your values, where you spend your money, things like this, how you spend your time, how you think about your elected leaders. I think this is a time for some reflection. So I'd ask people to just kind of reflect on given that, literally this is a major health threat to all of us and a threat to our economy and to our security, to everything. Does this shake you up and make you reconsider things a little bit? So I think a lot of people are going to be spending their money differently. Maybe they're going to be a little more frugal and save a little more just in case. Well, there are a lot of ways to save money that are good for the planet. For example, reducing food waste, maybe not throwing away those leftovers, maybe eating that leftover for lunch tomorrow. Sounds trivial, but saves a lot of money, saves a lot of food, and is actually one of our top drawdown solutions that, regular folks can contribute to. Not regular folks can't do everything. Like a regular person in a suburb in Michigan can't turn off a coal power plant, but they can reduce food waste at home and maybe their office and maybe their school. So that's important. Others might be like, hey, my car's, about to conk out. I need to get a new car. Like maybe you get one that, when you think about it, is less expensive to operate over its lifetime. That'll save you money. A more fuel efficient car. Maybe in other places it's an electric car, depending on how dense the charging network is and things like this. So people might be a little more economical and like, fuel efficiency matters. Or next time you retrofit your house, you might be thinking more about, oh yeah, maybe I should insulate the attic instead of adding a hot tub. Or maybe I should insulate the crawl space under my house in Michigan. You've got some cold winters, and home weatherization is a huge, huge thing that we still haven't done enough of in this country. Or if your furnace conks out, maybe I can work with my local utility to buy a more efficient furnace and maybe get that rebate that they're offering, or maybe some kind of financing. So the good news is that doing smart things like reducing your use of energy, being more energy efficient, the kind of cars you buy, how you live and weatherize your homes, what you eat, what you do with food leftovers, all those kinds of things give you a double win. They help the planet and they help your pocketbook at the same time. And there's, that's really a good win-win right there. So I think I would do that. Also, airline travel has been kind of singled out as a big climate culprit. In reality, it's not as big as some people think. It's about little less than 1.9% of global emissions are tied to airplanes. But it's still a big effect. And for some of us, that's for me, unfortunately, in the past, it was my biggest personal source of emissions, was flying around the world, ironically talking about climate change. So we need to address that too. And this is where video conferencing and telepresence is also one of our drawdown solutions. Like, hey, maybe we don't have to fly to that business conference. We can do some of them by Zoom later, or by whatever you like. Gosh, who wants to spend more time in airports anyway? Do you really want to go to the airport and wait 3 hours and sit in a crowded metal tube for hours on a time? I don't really like flying. So for me, this is maybe a good thing in a weird way that a lot of people are going to be learning how to do video conferencing better now all of a sudden. And I always laughed that before the pandemic, way before the pandemic, I'd be walking through O'Hare or Detroit Airport or something like that, any airport, and you'd see huge posters everywhere for video conferencing services, for Zoom and WebEx and whatever. And I always thought if they were really honest, the ads would say like, Zoom, sucks a lot less than flying, doesn't it? But I thought if they did that, they'd probably be banned from advertising in airports, so they never could do that. But I always thought it was like an advertisement for like, don't get on the plane, go home and just get on Zoom or whatever. Yeah. And hopefully that'll stick, that people will get a little more circumspect about their travel. Maybe they'll think a little bit more about what they spend their money on. And anybody who had parents or grandparents who lived through the Depression, they kind of had that lifelong kind of frugality gene. Even if they made money later, they always had these kind of reminders of like, hey, let's be a little more careful with our resources. And I think that's something Americans need to be reminded of now and again.
Yeah, I definitely see it happening in the world around me and people I know already. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the financial case for climate solutions. So often people think that making all of these changes, implementing all of these climate solutions would be so expensive, we can't afford to do it. But the Drawdown review points out that the savings significantly outweigh the costs if we implement these solutions. And that's not even looking at the savings from reduced health impacts of the pollution that we'll be saving and the reduced climate impacts that are going to cost billions.
Yeah. When people say this, what it really means is this is very inconvenient for some very rich and powerful people right now, so please don't talk about it. That's what that really means. Yeah. So for about 7.5 billion people in the world or whatever, this will benefit us. For about 10,000 people who are, shareholders and major shareholders and directors of boards of fossil fuel companies, for example, it's kind of a bad day, but they'll be okay. They'll be half a billionaire instead of a billionaire or whatever. I'm not feeling too bad for those folks. I do feel bad, of course, for people who will be displaced as economics do shift, and they're going to shift anyway. But when we see the breakdown of the coal-based kind of power plants in this country, yeah, I feel bad for coal miners. But that was dying anyway. You can't point the finger at environmentalists for that. It was a market force. And this is true for all economic disruptions. We do have to be careful to kind of retrain all people who are just by transitions. They're happening anyway. But this big lie out there that somehow solving climate change is going to bankrupt us or hurt the economy and hurt regular folks, it's just patently not true. And in fact, it's just the opposite. Solving climate change could be the biggest business and employment and job opportunity in human history. And we're being told the opposite, and it's a lie. That's all it is. Now, any change is disruption, and disruptions can sometimes hurt as we change gears, so to speak. But Americans are good at that. We're good at kind of reimagining and reinventing ourselves. We've done it again and again and again. And whether it's Detroit or Silicon Valley or other places of incredible innovation in American history, we've always led the way in changing the way the world sees things. If Henry Ford, worried too much about what about the buggy whip production companies and how, we can't do anything because we might disrupt their business, we wouldn't have modern transportation. If people, if Hewlett and Packard had said, well, we don't want to hurt the abacus business or whatever, or, by inventing the microprocessors and modern computing, we wouldn't have them today. So we do need disruption, but we have to be careful about what it means and how we help people along the way. But overall, this is a huge opportunity for our country, for the world, to make a better world. It turns out addressing climate change is going to be really good for us. Create jobs, it'll make us more secure, healthier, build better communities. What's not to like? But we're being told a big lie by, I hate to say it, but it's like a lot of entrenched interest, and the politicians they've bought and the media icons that they've bought are all telling us a big fat lie. And we have to acknowledge that and just say, no, this is not true. And it's not about partisanship. It's not political in that sense, but it is relevant. And I think scientists and everyone should call it a lie, even if it comes from your political party's background. It doesn't matter. Lies are lies and truth is truth. And America used to believe that. And I think we need to again.
Yeah. I think that's perfect. And no, looking at Michigan with the clean energy jobs and the new mobility jobs, some of the fastest growing sectors that need to get back at it. And so it is a great future. Turning to the political thing. So earlier on, you said both parties somewhat dysfunctional at the moment. Here we are 6 months away from a major election. I love how Project Drawdown, the sort of frame of it, doesn't lead with climate. It does, but the name of it itself sort of feels accessible.
Mm-hmm.
What are your hopes, optimistic or pessimistic, about the coming 6 months? And how do we come together to talk about this stuff instead of letting it drive us apart like it has a lot of ways?
Yeah, that's probably even, another dangerous phenomenon in this country and others lately has been this kind of hyperpolarization of not only, we can disagree. American political conflict is good. Actually partisanship to some degree is probably a good thing. We need competition of ideas and people, kind of being passionate and arguing and things, but we should do so with respect and with humility and with empathy to each other. And we've lost that. We have Eisenhower warned us about the military industrial complex. I worry much more today about a media political complex that's deliberately trying to drive people apart. Politicians and cable news and social media companies and so on benefit from driving Americans apart from each other and polarizing us. That's freaking dangerous. And look what's happening on both sides. I mean, it's maybe, you decide which side is doing the worst job. That's up to you. I have my own thoughts about that, but it's really dangerous. And I think we all have to kind of stop this and take a deep breath and remind ourselves we all love our children. We all care about building a better world for the next generation. Everyone in their inner heart is probably a good person, for the most part. And I still believe that. And the great leaders of our world, of our nation, have been people who've united us around a common vision of building something better. John Kennedy, asked us, almost 50 years ago today to come together as a country and, go to the moon within the coming decade. That was incredible. It was inspiring. Or in his inaugural asked us to think about our nation above ourselves. Do we hear that from leaders today? Hardly. Or I think about Martin Luther King. He didn't go around America saying, I have a nightmare. He didn't. He said, I have a dream. Here's a dream of a better world. Now, some of you aren't going to like this world at first, but guess what? In your hearts and in your bones, this is a better world. You're just deeply uncomfortable with it. But we need to get there. Obviously, especially with recent events, we're nowhere near fulfilling all of Martin Luther King's dreams, but we will get there someday. And we have to march toward that. He paid for that dream with his life, by the way, but we're still marching towards that dream. And it's a long journey. But I think climate change needs to be framed the same way. It's like, this is about building a better world for all of us. We need to hear all of us. We need to be working together towards a better world with solutions. And that's where framing matters. Like when we talk about climate change as the problem and we point fingers at villains and we shout a lot, I don't think that's really solving a lot of problems. And when you talk about solutions instead, and you don't point fingers, but instead you open your arms and you bring people together, you find that more people will listen. We've noticed in Drawdown, actually, it's much less kind of polarized reaction to our work than to, let's say, Al Gore's, recent book or whatever. As much as some people love Al Gore, a lot of people don't for just partisan reasons. And so it tends to divide us. Not picking on him, but just as an example. Where when we talk about solutions, you talk about possibilities and opportunities and maybe a little bit of hope possible, that maybe the world could be better after all. And you talk about collaboration instead of conflict. I think it brings a lot of people together. We do need conflict a little bit, but a healthier, more respectful, and more compassionate version of kind of sparring and bouncing ideas off each other. That's fine. But we've really lost our way this way. And I hope to solve climate change, we just have to stand up to be better people. It's only if we become better people can we build a better future. And a lot of the troubles for climate change really begin in our hearts and minds. I know it's cliche, but it's true. And so I think we need to take a big step back and kind of think about what do we really have in common? How do we find empathy and common ground with each other and find a way forward? And I think it's true for a lot of our national issues, not just climate change, but climate change is certainly true.
Well, that's such a great answer. And I think that's just beautiful how you put that, how you framed that. And it really makes me think about the Drawdown book and the new review. and how, because it's focused on solutions that are available to us now, and it paints this picture of what is possible, the kind of world that we could have that's, we're solving the climate crisis, we're improving our lives, everyone's lives. And so I just want to, we're running out of time. So I just want to ask if I want to tell our listeners to check out the website, because there's so much on that website that you can find. And what is the website?
Yeah, it's drawdown.org. And there's thanks for an opportunity to shout out about that. So drawdown.org, and we have tons and tons of resources there about climate solutions, hundreds of pages of details about different solutions and so on. But to begin, I would encourage people to download a free book called the Drawdown Review. It's just a big PDF. You can you can print it out if you want. You can read it on your laptop, on your iPad, whatever. And we decided to give that book away for free rather than publishing it in a more traditional manner. And it's actually downloading faster than our first book even sold. And that was a New York Times bestseller. So it seems to be catching on, and we've put no money into marketing. It's been all word of mouth. Wow. So I hope that's a good resource for communities, for teachers, for just everyday folks who want to learn more about climate solutions. And I want to point out that we're a nonprofit, we're nonpartisan, we're non-commercial. Our only purpose is to synthesize what the world knows scientifically about climate solutions, and then share that with the world in the most clear and unbiased way we can manage. And so I hope that provides a service for the world, and we'd love to hear from you too. So there are places you can kind of chime in on our website and comment. But also following us on social media. If you look for just Project Drawdown on Twitter or Facebook is where we are most active. You'll see us there too, and we'd love to hear you on social media as well.
Great. Any last words, anything else that you want to add about this work that we haven't covered today?
Yeah, I guess so. One last thing maybe is it's really very easy right now to feel almost kind of hopeless about everything in the world. I mean, maybe this is just me speaking, but I hear a lot of other folks saying the same thing, that with our kind of political vitriol about the new pandemic, about the economic anxiety and fears people have about their jobs and their futures, and then this long-term picture of climate change, we have so much to be afraid of. And there are people who are trying to make us afraid on purpose for their own gain. Don't let them. We have a lot to be worried about. There's every right to feel anxious and depressed. Sit with that for a while. That's good. I think we need to talk about that and acknowledge these things. My friends who work in mental health and psychiatry talk about we do need to process that anxiety and grief. But we also need to, once we can do that, step up and roll up our sleeves and get to work on solving the problems. We're best when we're confronted with big challenges. And maybe I'm a dorky, patriotic, guy, but I actually believe that's still true, that we can still be at our best. I think that if we really rise to the occasion and become the people we could be versus the people we are today, it'd be magnificent. I mean, I really believe a better world is still within our grasp, and the human mind is so creative and the human heart is so empathetic when we are at our best. Don't let others manipulate us into being our worst, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And the future isn't written yet. Maybe that's the last message, is the future, it belongs to the people who build it. And so if you want to build a better future, get out there and start being part of it. Because if you don't, it's going to be left to somebody else. And it may not be the future you want. So please look forward to the future and try to leave something better for the next generation. That's probably the most important thing we could ever do.
I love that. That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Foley.
Thank you so much. This is fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's podcast.
If you appreciate this content, become a podcast supporter at groundworkcenter.org/podcast. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen in. Subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on Facebook at Groundwork Center and at Michigan Climate Action Network.
Speaking of Resilience is created by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and the Michigan Climate Action Network. This episode was produced by Miriam Owsley and Jeff Smith and hosted by Kate Madigan and Dan Worth.